Well, if you're with us last week, you know that we began a brand new mini series, a series within our series on the book of First Corinthians, and we have called this brand new mini series The Talk. If you're a parent or a child, and most of us have been both, then you know what the talk is. The talk is that time where you have to speak with your teen or your preteen child about sex. No one wants to have the talk. The parents don't want to give the talk. The kids don't want to hear the talk, but we know that the talk is necessary. Without the talk, some bad information is going to be passed along. And so we have the talk, even though it is uncomfortable for everybody. No one is enthused about the talk at home, and we are even less enthused about it at church. But last week, we started looking at what Paul teaches about sexual morality. Last week, we started examining what Paul says about sexual ethics for followers of Jesus. And so last week, we just basically established the idea that there is, in fact, a Christian sexual ethic. Last week, we looked at Paul's claim that sexual morality exists. We said last week that to most people, sexual morality is an oxymoron. It's a phrase made up of two words that don't seem to belong together. To most people today, sex is a private, intimate matter, one based on emotions and feelings, but morality is a public, universal claim based on logic and the common good. And so to our modern ears, those terms are incompatible. And so in our modern world, we think that sexual morality can't really exist except in the most minimalist of ways. And so when Paul condemns sex outside of marriage, when Paul condemns homosexual sex, when Paul condemns pornography, we today tend to think that he is being repressive and misogynistic and homophobic. To many of us today, sexual morality is just a code word for repression and for oppression. We think it's a cover for hate or for anger. And so many people think that Paul must talk about sexual morality because he is an angry, hateful guy. But last week we considered the question, what if Paul isn't angry or hateful? What if Paul understood sexual morality not as a means to repress and oppress people? What if Paul saw sexual morality as a way to bless people and to promote human flourishing? Because we saw last week that Paul indeed saw sexual morality as a blessing, not a curse. Paul believed in the God who created the world, and Paul believed that the God who created the world gave us rules and guidelines so that we could thrive in his creation. And so last week we looked at Genesis chapter 1, and there we saw that God did two main things in his act of creation. First, he gave the world form and shape. We might say that when God created the world, he gave boundaries. And then after God gave the boundaries, he poured his blessing into those boundaries, filling our earth with good things. And because we believe in a creator God who blessed and filled the earth, we believe that blessing is found in God's boundaries. And this is particularly true when it comes to sexual ethics. Man and women were the pinnacle of God's creation. And even as God created the boundary of male and female biology, he poured the blessing of sex into that boundary and into the boundary of marriage. And so last week, we just simply saw that Paul believed in sexual immorality. He believed in sexual immorality because he believed in the God who made the universe. And he believed that God gave us boundaries and rules and ethics that we could be blessed and that we could flourish in this place that God created. That's why Paul tells us to flee sexual immorality. Paul believes that sexual immorality is harmful and debilitating to us because it removes us from the boundaries where God promises to bless us. And so, based on the account of creation found in Genesis, Paul says that sex is to be reserved for a man and woman inside the bounds of marriage. God has created us that way, and we are best served to live that way. Now, even as I say that, I know some people are still not convinced, right? This idea that sex is to be reserved for marriage and for a relationship between a man and a woman is a very tough sell in our society. Making that claim can make people very, very angry. Most people today do not want to hear about Paul's sexual ethic. Now, I'm not assuming that everyone here this morning is a follower of Jesus. And even if you claim to be a follower of Jesus, I don't assume that you agree with what Paul is teaching here this morning. I know there are many people who object to this sexual ethic. And while the objections could be various, I think there are two primary objections to what Paul teaches here. And those objections to what Paul teaches could be summarized by two phrases. Those two phrases are back up and lighten up. Back up and lighten up. Hearing Paul's teaching on sexual morality, that's what some of you might want to say to Paul. You might want to say to Paul, back up, and you might also want to tell Paul to lighten up. Now, what do I mean when I say some people want Paul to back up and to lighten up? Well, those who want Paul to back up want Paul to get out of their space, right? Those people want to say, stay in your lane, Paul. My life is my own. Back up and let me have the space to live the way I want to live. Most people would say to Paul, I am free to behave as I want to behave. No one has the power to restrict my sexual choices as long as I am not infringing on anyone else's choices. In other words, most people would say to Paul, I can do whatever I want with whatever partner I want as long as both of us consent to what is happening. Paul, you've got to back up and get out of my business because sex is one of the truest expressions of my freedom as an individual. You have no right to comment on that freedom. You have no right to restrict it. So the first objection to Paul would be to back up. But the second objection to Paul would be to lighten up. And this would probably be like the least angry of the two objections. The person who would say lighten up is probably not as angry as the person who would say back up. But this is still probably a pretty powerful objection. What would Paul's opponents mean when they tell Paul to lighten up? Well, the person who would tell Paul to lighten up would say, Paul, sex is just sex. Sex is not a big deal. It's an activity you do with another person. Sex is like playing a board game. It's like going out to dinner together. It's like seeing a movie. It's just a way to spend time with somebody else. It's not a big deal. Stop worrying about it so much, Paul. When you tell people not to have sex, it's like telling them not to play Monopoly together. It's just a social activity that people enjoy. And so those are the objections to Paul's sexual morality. They are back up and lighten up. And if you're sitting here with those objections in mind this morning, I know you probably feel very progressive. You probably feel very enlightened. And in our society, our thoughts about sex have become a marker for how enlightened and progressive we are, And so we signal our progressiveness by being on Tinder. We signal our progressiveness by supporting gay marriage. We signal our progressiveness by watching all those shows on HBO with all of the sex on them, If you object to Paul's sexual immorality by saying back up and lighten up, you probably think you are a true child of the 21st century. You are overcoming Paul's first century darkness by stating your objections to what he taught. But if you think that, I have a surprise for you this morning. And here is the surprise. The backup and the lighten up objections are not new to the 21st century. As a matter of fact, the backup and the lighten up objections were around back in the first century when Paul wrote. Contrary to what you think, Paul would not be surprised to hear you say back up or lighten up. As a matter of fact, it turns out this is exactly what the Corinthians were saying to Paul when he tried to teach them about sexual immorality. And so open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And this morning we're going to look at verses 12 through 20 again. And there I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. I'm going to show you the objections that the Corinthians had to Paul's sexual morality. You're going to see if you object by saying back up or lighten up, you are not as progressive as you think you are. Those objections have existed for a very long time. So follow as I read 1 Corinthians 6, 12 through 20. And again, if you don't have a Bible or Bible app, the words will be on the screens alongside me. Inspired by the Holy Spirit, this is what Paul writes. He says, I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You say food for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body. But whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. So we said last week, the main idea here is found in verse 18. Verse 18, Paul writes, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. So the main idea is flee sexual immorality. Put more positively, the idea is be sexually moral. We talked last week about what Paul's sexual morality was, right? Read through the rest of Paul's letters, you'll discover the type of sexual behaviors that Paul prohibited for followers of Jesus. And so Paul prohibited fornication, sleeping together outside of a marriage. He prohibited adultery. He prohibited homosexuality. He prohibited pedophilia. He even prohibited pornography without really knowing fully what that was. In short, Paul said sex should be limited to a marriage relationship between a man and a woman. Now, here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is that the Corinthians did not agree with Paul. Even though Paul's readers were Christians, they had a far different sexual ethic than Paul. Because as we read through this passage, it is very clear that there was a lot of sexual activity going on in the church community. It is also clear that not a lot of this activity was happening between husbands and wives. We talked last week about how in 1 Corinthians 5, we learned that a man was sleeping with his stepmom, likely while his dad was still alive and possibly still married to her. In this chapter, verse 16 tells us that some of the Corinthian men were sleeping with prostitutes. Verse 13 tells us that others in the Corinthian church were attending banquets where gluttony and debauchery went hand in hand. And so you can see by their behavior that the Corinthians did not agree with Paul's sexual morality. They were giving approval to different types of sexual behavior. Now, to many of us, it might be surprising, right, that Christians were openly committing incest, patronizing prostitutes, and attending orgies. You think, how on earth could they justify this behavior? Well, I think they justified this behavior the same way that people do today. And so in this passage, we find two Corinthian objections to Paul's teaching about sex. They're found right at the beginning of the passage. So look back at verse 12. Verse 12 starts one of the two objections that many of the Corinthians were giving to Paul's teaching. Verse 12 says this: I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. And so what was the first objection that the Corinthians had to Paul's teaching? It was, I have the right to do anything. Basically, I have the right to freedom. Sex is the expression of my freedom as an individual. So what was objection number one by the Corinthians? It was back up Paul. Objection number one is sex is one of the truest expressions of my freedom as an individual. You have no right to comment on that freedom. You have no right to restrict it. And the second objection is found in verse 13. Look there. Paul writes, you say food for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. What was objection number two? It was food for the stomach and the stomach for food. You say, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about sex. How did we get the food? Well, the Corinthians were making an analogy. The Corinthians were saying God created us with the need for food, so we eat. And the Corinthians are saying God created us with a desire for sex, so we have sex. Sex is just a natural instinct like hunger. Our bodies were made with a desire, we fulfill it. So basically, the Corinthians are saying to Paul, lighten up, Paul. Sex is no big deal. It's just a natural desire like eating. Why put all of these rules around it? So what do we learn from the Corinthians' objections to Paul's teaching? We learn that our two objections to sexual immorality are not new. You may think you're signaling your progressiveness by saying back up and lighten up when it comes to sex, but your objections to Paul's sexual morality are as old and dated as the concept of sexual morality itself. And so there is an important lesson here. You don't get to win the sexual morality argument by saying your ideas are newer and more forward-looking. That's how people typically respond to Christian sexual morality these days. They say, you guys are so backwards, You guys are living in the past. You need to catch up to the 21st century. But that's not a fair argument. Why? Because both sides of the argument are as old as time itself. There were even people in ancient times objecting to what Paul taught about Christian morality. So sexual ethics is not decided by whose argument is most current. It's decided by whose argument is most true. Paul doesn't hold us to sexual ethics because he is old-fashioned. He holds us to a sexual ethic because the arguments back up and lighten up are flawed. Let's start with the backup objection. You may make the very same objection that the Corinthians made. You may feel that as an individual, you have incredible freedom. You may feel that no one has a right to tell you what to do and what not to do, especially when it comes to a personal and intimate thing like sex. Are you ready for a surprise here? The surprise is this. If you think you have the freedom to do whatever you want to do, the Apostle Paul actually agrees with you. He agrees with you. He doesn't contradict your conclusion that you have freedom. Look at verses 12 through 13. In those verses, Paul does not challenge the Corinthians' claim to freedom. In verses 12 through 13, the Corinthians say to Paul, I have the right to do anything. And what does Paul say in response? He says, you sure do. He said, yep, you're right. Now, he doesn't actually affirm the Corinthians' claim of freedom, but notice he doesn't challenge their premise about freedom either. Instead, what Paul says to them is, as you think about your freedom, you have to ask yourself two questions. Question number one is this: is my use of freedom good for me? And question number two is my freedom really freedom? Am I really as free as I think I am when I'm doing this thing that defines me as free? Now, can I be honest with you this morning? According to the Apostle Paul, you have freedom to engage in almost any type of sexual behavior you want to. You can have sex outside of marriage if you want to. You can have an affair. You can sleep with someone of your own gender. You are free to do those things, and that those things are not against the law. Under our nation's civil law, no one is going to arrest you for those things. The laws of our land say you as an adult have the freedom to choose your sexual behavior. And so the law says you are free to do what you want to do in that matter. But the law doesn't tell you whether or not your sexual choices are good ones. You see, what Paul wants you to know is just because you're free to do something doesn't mean that you should do something, right? That's Paul's point in verse 12. In verse 12, Paul writes, not everything is beneficial. And so when it comes to sex outside of marriage, you have to ask yourself a question. You can say, I am free to have sex outside of marriage, but is it good for me? You know, you are free to eat McDonald's 3 meals a day, every day, right? It will taste good going down. You will enjoy your burgers and fries and Coke, but I wouldn't recommend eating it all day, every day, right? You're free to eat it all day, every day if you want to. As long as you have the money, nobody's going to stop you. But it doesn't mean it's beneficial for you in the long run. What Paul is saying is freedom does not equal necessity, and freedom does not equal benefit. Now, Paul doesn't say why sex outside of marriage might not be beneficial for us, but we can imagine a number of reasons, you know. What's become one of the outcomes of our country's casual sex culture? Well, in August of 2018, the New York Times reported the U.S. had a whopping 2.3 million new STD infections. That was an all-time high. And that's not the only danger. What's another outcome of our casual sex culture? Well, some women's advocacy groups report that 11.2% of women will experience some type of sexual assault in their early 20s. And the toll isn't just physical. In 2013, a Psychology Today article reported that a great majority of college students reported feeling depressed, regretful, and uncomfortable after sexual encounters with someone that they were not married to. And the Psychology Today article, again, not a Christian publication, actually warned college students that though they were free to have sex with anyone they want, they might want to consider what the cost would be of having random hookups and of being. Sounds a little bit like Paul, doesn't it? You may indeed be free in that no one will stop you, but is it beneficial? Is it worth the physical, emotional, and spiritual consequences that come with it? So Paul says you should ask if your freedom is really beneficial, but he also says you should ask if your freedom is really freedom. Now, the word freedom is a tricky word to define, isn't it? Because freedom can have at least two meanings. Freedom can mean able to do whatever I want without restriction. But freedom can also mean free from the control of another. And so Paul suggests to the Corinthians they were free in one sense, they could do whatever they want, but they were not free in another. Why? Because they were controlled by their sexual desire. You see, sexual appetites are good and wholesome inside marriage, but the Corinthians weren't having sex inside of marriage, as we've seen. They were pursuing sex wherever they could find it. And Paul suggests that this means that they were not in control of their desires were in control of them. And Paul says that is not freedom. That's why Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 6, he says, I will not be mastered by anything. But the Corinthians were being mastered by their desire in that they had no freedom. And so the question stands for us today. Is our culture's sexual ethic a sign of its freedom or of its enslavement? We like to say that we are sexually liberated, but Paul would suggest the fact is that we are really sexually enslaved. We know we should be faithful to our partner, right? But we end up having sex with other people. Why? Why do we have flings and affairs? Because we aren't controlling our desires. Our desires are controlling us. You know, the news is full of stories of teachers, men and women who had relationships with their students. They go to jail. They lose their careers. They might even lose their marriage if they're married. Why do they trade all this for a few sexual encounters? Because they're not controlling their desires. Their desires are controlling them. Men spend hour after hour clicking on the computer, chasing sexual images. Why? because we aren't controlling our desires are controlling us. Our culture's so-called sexual liberation is actually sexual slavery. We are obsessed with sex because we are slave to our passions and our desires. We call our ethic liberated, but the opposite is actually quite true. And so we want to tell Paul to back up. We want to say we're free to have sex with whoever and whenever we want. Sex is an exercise of our individual freedom and choice. And Paul doesn't argue with us. He doesn't challenge our assertion of freedom. He just tells us to ask two questions of ourselves. Is the exercise of our freedom beneficial for us? And are we sure that we are really free? So if you think sex outside of marriage between a man and woman is really okay, do an honest evaluation. Ask, has this behavior been beneficial for me? Am I better emotionally, physically, and spiritually because of my sexual liberation? And am I really free? Do I control sex or does sex control me? If you spend hours a day thinking about finding sex partners, sex controls you. If you can't look at a member of the opposite sex without thinking about sex, sex controls you. If you've ever had regret after a sexual encounter, then likely sex controls you. Ask yourself if your sexual freedom is really all that you think it is. So Paul has an answer when we say back up, and he also has an answer when we say lighten up. Again, the Corinthians are telling Paul to lighten up in verse 13. There they compared the desire for sex and the desire for food. And verse 13 says, food for the stomach and the stomach for food. And so again, in verse 13, the Corinthians remind Paul, hey, we all have sexual appetites. And filling a sexual appetite is just like filling our stomach. It's no big deal. It's just a natural desire. And so Paul's question is that true? Is sex no big deal? Is sex just a form of exercise like going for a jog together? Is it a form of entertainment like going to a movie? Is sex just a way to pass time when you're bored, like playing a board game? Now, to those of you who are older, right, that might sound like a ridiculous question. To those of you who are older, like you did not grow up thinking about sex that way. But to the younger people in our audience, this has become a natural way to think about sex, right? I mean, to older folks, sex on a first date was unthinkable. You know, back in the day, even if you didn't believe that sex should be regulated to marriage, you wouldn't have sex on a first date. Now, even people who didn't see sex as being regulated to marriage saw sex as something special that a relationship had to build up to. But now, for younger people, sex is often the way that people get to know each other. You know, so young people have sex, and then they determine that they'll have a relationship, right? Thanks to those apps you have on your phone where you can flip through prospective partners, you can hook up and then determine if you really want to be with that person or not. So in our world, sex has become another thing to do on a first date, just like seeing a movie or like going out to dinner. It's just a natural desire, and there's nothing wrong with our using our bodies to fulfill that desire. Our society says sex is no big deal. But Paul says sex is a very big deal. Why? Because Paul says sex is not just a physical activity. It's not just about two bodies coming together. Paul says sex is about creating intimacy. It's not just a physical connection, it's a spiritual connection as well. Look at what Paul writes in verses 15 through 17. I'm not going to read it, but look at what he writes there as I talk about it. Paul is writing there about the Corinthian men who are going to visit prostitutes. And most of them thought going to see a prostitute was just a way to get their physical needs met. It wasn't a big deal. But Paul's words in verses 15 through 17 remind those Corinthians they were not only making a physical connection with those women. He says, with the physical connection came a spiritual connection as well. And to understand what Paul says, we have to understand how Paul looked at men and women. We have to understand what he believed about humanity. Because Paul believed that all humans like us were composed of two parts. He believed we have a material part, and he believed that we have a spiritual part. And when people connect through sex, two spirits or souls inhabit one body. Right? Paul quotes from the Old Testament. He writes, the two will become one flesh. And Paul is trying to show in these verses that sex generates tremendous emotional intimacy and spiritual connection. And so if we think that sex is just a physical activity, we are wrong. It creates a tremendous bond between two people. That's why it should be reserved for the relationship of marriage. You see, the truth is our culture has it all wrong now. We think that sex is a prelude to getting to know one another. We think that sex is the start of building a relationship or a friendship. But sex is not the beginning of intimacy. It is not the generator of intimacy. It is meant to be the fulfillment and sustainment of intimacy. God created sex so that a man and woman connected by vows of marital faithfulness could build a bond that would last a lifetime. Sex was not meant to generate connection. It was meant to deepen a connection that two people had already committed to through the act of marriage. And so Paul would say sex is not just jogging together. It's not just playing Monopoly. No, it's about creating deep intimacy with someone that you are going to spend a lifetime with. And I imagine that some people will scoff at this, right? I think a lot of people make fun of Paul's teaching here. But if you ever had a sexual relationship with someone, then you know what Paul writes is true. Sex has a way of tying people together, even when that's not necessarily what they want. You may have intended something to be a one-night stand, but sometimes it can be hard to get that person out of your life. There's a certain emotional responsiveness that you have through that act, whether you want that responsiveness or not. Now, again, don't get me wrong. It's possible to dull the intimacy of sex. When you sleep around, your heart gets deadened. When you sleep around, you don't find the connection that God created sex for. So there are people who lose that natural intimacy by having partner after partner, but that is not the norm. I think most of us, if we're honest, would agree with Paul's teaching here. We know in our hearts that sex is about more than a material connection. We know that souls and emotions get united as well as bodies. And because souls are united, sex has to be saved with the commitment of marriage. That is the only relationship that can properly benefit from the intimacy of sex. And so you may have physical desires, but that doesn't mean that you have to fulfill them. Because you were not created to be a slave to your desires. You were created for relationship with God. And Paul really has the same response to the lighten up objection as he did to the backup objection. Paul says in verse 13, the body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. You were not created to fulfill your every desire, but you were created to serve God. Your body was not designed to satisfy you, but to worship him. You know, last week in Genesis 1, we saw that men and women were created in God's image. And that means that we were given bodies that we might glorify God and not ourselves. And so our bodies are not to satisfy us. They are to honor and to worship God. And so I hope you've seen today that God's wisdom about sex is not outdated. It continues to speak powerfully to our culture and our society. The behaviors of our society are really as old as time itself. And so the wisdom of God continues to speak as powerfully as it ever did. Now, unfortunately, I know that God's wisdom can cause guilt and shame. We can feel bad about our past seeing God's truth. I want you to know Jesus died on the cross to bear our guilt and shame. He rose on the third day to have victory over these things. And so this sermon is not a sermon that condemns. It is a sermon that offers life. Because through Jesus, you can have your past washed away. And through Jesus, you can be empowered to flee from these things and run to honoring and worshiping God. Next week, as we finish our series here at The Talk, we're going to look at how we as Christians should view our bodies. The interesting thing is most people think that Christians have a negative view of the body. Most people think that Christians are ashamed of the human body, but we will find that is not true. I know these sermons have been a little tough. Next week, I promise you, it's going to be inspiring, okay? Next week, we're going to see that God has a better view of us than we have of ourselves. So if you're like, man, these two sermons, they've been a little rough. They've been a little bit of a downer. Next week, we're going to end on a positive note, as they say, right? So we're going to see what God has taught us about who we are in Christ. But let's have a word of prayer together.